That's all ahead. But we begin tonight with one of the more unlikely and more politically pleasant events in the very short history of this show. It was the moment when Rand Paul announced his candidacy for the United States Senate right here on this show just about a year ago. Dr. Paul, I understand that you yourself have some political ambitions. I was hoping you might talk about those tonight on this show.
Yeah, I do. I'm happy tonight to announce on the Rachel Maddow show that I'm forming an exploratory committee to run for the U.S. Senate.
Well, yesterday, Rand Paul walloped his Republican primary opponent for that Senate seat, Kentucky Secretary of State Trey Grayson. Mr. Grayson was endorsed by establishment figures like the state's other senator, Minority Leader Mitch McConnell, by Dick Cheney, by Rudy Giuliani, by the Chamber of Commerce. But Rand Paul won that race, and he won it handily.
I have a message from the Tea Party, a message that is loud and clear and does not mince words. We've come to take our government back.
In the wake of last night's big victory, the discussion of Mr. Paul's win has turned from politics, he won, he beat the machine, to policy. What does Rand Paul stand for? Who did Kentucky Republicans just nominate to be their Republican nominee for Senate this November? Getting a lot of attention already is Dr. Paul today discussing his views on the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Americans with Disabilities Act on National Public Radio's program, All Things Considered.
But are you saying that had you been around at the time, you would have hoped that you would have marched with Martin Luther King but voted with Barry Goldwater against the 1964 Civil Rights Act?
Well, actually, I think it's confusing on a lot of cases with what actually was in the Civil Rights case, because, see, a lot of the things that actually were in the bill I'm in favor of. I'm in favor of everything with regards to ending institutional racism. So I think there's a lot to be desired in the Civil Rights. And to tell you the truth, I haven't really read all through it because it was past 40 years ago and hadn't been a real pressing issue in the campaign on whether we're going to vote for the Civil Rights Act.
But it's been one of the major developments in American history in the course of your lifetime. I mean, do you think the 64 Civil Rights Act, or the ADA for that matter, were just overreaches in that business shouldn't be bothered by people with a basis in law to sue them for redress?
Right. I think a lot of things could be handled locally. For example, I think that we should try to do everything we can to allow for people with disabilities and handicaps. You know, we do it in our office with wheelchair ramps and things like that. I think if you have a two-story office and you hire someone who's handicapped, it might be reasonable to let them have an office on the first floor rather than the government saying you have to have a $100,000 elevator. And I think when you get to solutions like that, the more local the better, and the more common sense the decisions are rather than having a federal government make those decisions.
Rand Paul's brand new Democratic opponent in Kentucky is Jack Conway. He's already taking aim at those positions. But those comments today on NPR are not the first time that Dr. Paul has gone on the record on this potentially more controversial side of his small government views. Here was Dr. Paul last month talking with the editorial board of the Louisville Courier-Journal newspaper.
Would you have voted for the Civil Rights Act of 1964?
I like the Civil Rights Act in the sense that it ended discrimination in all public domains, and I'm all in favor of that.
But?
You had to ask me the but. I don't like the idea of telling private business owners. I abhor racism. I think it's a bad business decision to ever exclude anybody from your restaurant. But at the same time, I do believe in private ownership. But I think there should be absolutely no discrimination in anything that gets any public funding. And that's most of what the Civil Rights Act was about, to my mind.
It was the substance of that editorial board session, that federal protections against discrimination essentially amount to government overreach when they impinge on the rights of private business owners to run their businesses the way they see fit. It was that discussion that led the Courier-Journal to endorse neither Republican candidate in the party's Senate primary. The Courier-Journal actually called the Republican primary a, quote, dismal choice. And they said, quote, the trouble with Dr. Paul is that despite his independent thinking, much of what he stands for is repulsive to people in the mainstream. For instance, he holds an unacceptable view of civil rights, saying that while the federal government can enforce integration of government jobs and facilities, private business people should be able to decide whether they want to serve black people or gays or any other minority group, end quote. Joining us now is the candidate himself, who can very ably speak for himself, Dr. Rand Paul. Dr. Paul, thank you so much for coming back on the show, and congratulations on your big victory last night.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you for that wonderful intro piece. Quite a collection.
I know this must feel like frying pan and into the fire here so soon after the election, with really being the focus of this national storm right now, everybody trying to figure out what you meant by these things. But let's talk about it. Was the Courier-Journal right? Do you believe that private business people should be able to decide whether they want to serve black people or gays or any other minority group, as they said?
Well, I think to put things in perspective, when the Courier-Journal does not endorse a Republican, that's not something very unusual in our state. They typically don't endorse Republicans, and it's a very Democratic paper. But with regard to racism, I don't believe in any racism. I don't think we should have any government racism, any institutional form of racism. You know, one interesting historical tidbit, one of my favorite historical characters is William Lloyd Garrison. And one of the interesting things about desegregation and bringing people together, do you know when it happened in Boston?
What do you mean, desegregation in general?
Do you know when we got rid of the Jim Crow laws and when we got rid of segregation and a lot of the abhorrent practices in the South? Do you know when we got rid of it in Boston?
Why don't you tell me what you're getting at?
Well, it was in 1840. So I think it is sort of a stain on the history of America that it took us 120 years to desegregate the South. But William Lloyd Garrison was a champion and an abolitionist who wrote about freeing the slaves back in the 18-teens and 20s and 30s and labored in obscurity to do this. He was flogged, put in jails. He was with Frederick Douglass being thrown off of trains. But, you know, they desegregated transportation in Boston in 1840, and I think that was an impressive and amazing thing, but also points out the sadness that it took us 120 years to desegregate the South, and a lot of that was institutional racism, was absolutely wrong and something that I absolutely oppose.
In terms of legal remedies for persistent discrimination, though, if there was a private business, say in Louisville, say somewhere in your home state, that wanted to not serve black patrons or wanted to not serve gay patrons or somebody else on the basis of their on the basis of a characteristic that they decided they didn't like as a private business owner, would you think that they had a legal right to do so, to put up a "Blacks Not Served Here" sign?
Well, the interesting thing is, you know, you look back to the 1950s and 1960s at the problems we faced. There were incredible problems. You know, the problems had to do mostly with voting. They had to do with schools. They had to do with public housing. And so this is what the civil rights largely addressed, and all things that I largely agree with.
But what about private businesses? I mean, I don't want to be badgering you on this, but I do want an answer. Do you think that a private business has a right to say, we don't serve black people?
Yeah, I'm not in favor of any discrimination of any form. I would never belong to any club that excluded anybody for race. We still do have private clubs in America that can discriminate based on race. But I think what's important about this debate is not getting into any specific gotcha on this, but asking the question, what about freedom of speech? Should we limit speech from people we find abhorrent? Should we limit racists from speaking? I don't want to be associated with those people, but I also don't want to limit their speech in any way, in the sense that we tolerate boorish and uncivilized behavior, because that's one of the things freedom requires, is that we allow people to be boorish and uncivilized, but that doesn't mean we approve of it. I think the problem with this debate is by getting muddled down into it, the implication is somehow that I would approve of any racism or discrimination, and I don't in any form or fashion.
But isn't being in favor of civil rights but against the Civil Rights Act a little like saying you're against high cholesterol but you're in favor of fried cheese? I mean, and the Civil Rights Act was the federal government stepping in to protect civil rights because they weren't otherwise being protected. It wasn't a hypothetical. There were businesses that were saying black people cannot be served here, and the federal government stepped in and said, no, you actually don't have that choice to make. The federal government is coming in and saying you can't make that choice as a business owner. Which side of that debate would you put yourself on?
In the totality of it, I'm in favor of the federal government being involved in civil rights. And that's, mostly what the Civil Rights Act was about. And that was ending